This is part 3 of GS3 revision marathon of economy. In this, we are going to discuss infrastructure, energy, and industrial policy. In this, we are going to discuss 3 chapters. First one is chapter number 9, second one, chapter number 10A, and third one, chapter number 10B. So, what is the discussion? What will be the discussion in the chapter 9? In this chapter 9, we are going to discuss who finance the asset and a contract about risk, etc. And 10th A, what the asset delivers and capacity is not equal to generation. And 10th B, we are going to discuss what arrives afterwards, the artifact comes first. So, what is the chapter number 9? That is investment models, PPP, and asset monetization. Asset monetization. So, what is the pattern here? 9 questions across 13 years. They split into exactly 2 families. What are the families? 5 questions are 5 PPP alive and 4 FDI dormant. What is dormant and what is alive? We are going to discuss in this particular section. 5 are about the PPP asked in 2013, 2014, 2017, 2020 and 2022. Regarding FDI asked in 2013, 2014, 2017. Comes to the FDI, 2013 2 questions asked, 2014 and 2016. All of them clustered in 8 months and silent ever since. So the BPP family is alive. The FDI family in this head is dormant. So on the PPP family has a shape. It starts with is PPP good or bad in 2013, moves to how do you protect the future in 2014, then to sector applications, airports in 2017, railway stations in 2022, and in 2020 to the contract itself. The examiner has moved from judging the model to examining his machinery. It's machinery. So, but nothing has been asked from this head since 2022. And this corpus, a 4-year silence in a live head is not exhaustion. It is a cue. And the trigger is sitting here, that is the National Monetization Pipeline 2.0 announced in budget 2025 and 2026. And detailed by NITI Aayog with an 852 project, 17 lakh crore 3-year PPP pipeline behind it. So, you have to prepare this head as tier 1. So, moving to the first scene, that is capital formation. The concept the examiner asked for by name. Here is the 2020 question, 15 marker question. Explain the meaning of investment in an economy in terms of capital formation. Discuss the factors to be considered while designing a concession against between a public entity and a private entity. So what is the public and private entity? That question has 2 halves. That most answers merge and the last marks for. This scene answers the first half. The next scene answers the second. What is the first scene? Investment first half. Investment in economics is not the purchase of financial asset. Buying a share is a transfer of ownership. Nothing new is produced. Investment is the addition to the stock physical capital in an economy. The plant, the machine, the road, the transmission line, the port berth, etc. The national accounts call this gross capital formation. Net of depreciation, it is net capital formation. And the distinction is the entire point of the question. because an economy that invests only enough to replace that what wears out is standing still. So three things to follow here. What are the three things follow? And each is a mark. The first one is capital formation requires savings first. You cannot invest what nobody has abstained from consuming. Domestic savings or foreign savings borrowed in. And the second one is savings become capital formation only through intermediation. Banks, bond markets, equity, and the government's own budget. A high savings rate with a broken financial system produces no investment. No investment. Third one, capital formation rises future output capacity. Future output capacity. That is why it is treated differently from the consumption in every budget document you will quote. Now connect it to the paper. When the union judgments, when the union budget separates revenue expenditure from capital expenditure, it is separating consumption from capital formation. When the economic survey says the government of India's capital outlay rose from 5.92 lakh crore in financial year 2022 to 11.21 lakh crore in financial year 2026 budget estimates, it is describing public capital formation. And when it puts a multiplier of 2.5 to 3.5 on that spending, it is claiming that a rupee capital formation returns 2.5 to 3.5 rupees of GDP over the medium term. So government of India capex 3.07 to 5.92, then 2025 2026 11.21 lakh crore. What is the multiplier here? What 2.5 to 3.5? So the numbers behind the union capital expenditure from 3.07 lakh crore in financial year 2019, then 5.92 lakh crore in financial year 2022, then up to 90%, 92%, and on the 11.21 crore lakh crore in financial year 26 budget estimates, up another 89%. In budget estimates 2026-2027, capital expenditure is 12 lakh 21,821 crore and effective capital expenditure 17 lakh 14,523 crore. So this scene ends on the concept. Capital formation is what investment means before it means PPP. And everything that follows in this chapter is a question about who financed that formation and what terms. And then we are moving to the second half, that is concession agreement. What to actually write here? What is the concession agreement here? This is the second half of the 2020 question, and it is the highest value seen in the chapter because a concession agreement is a risk allocation document and almost nobody writes it that way. So this you have to say this line first, then structuring everything under it. A concession agreement is not a contract about money. It is a contract about risk. Who carries which risk, for how long, and at what price. Every clause you name should be attached to a risk. There are 8 heads. First one is scope and service standards. What exactly is being built and operated and to what measurable standard. And second one, the concession period. The concession period, how long, and critically whether it is fixed or variable with the traffic. And the third one is the risk matrix. The risk allocation matrix. Who bears construction, traffic and demand, land clearance, currency, interest rate, force majeure, and political risk. And fourth one is revenue model. User pays annuity, user pays annuity, hybrid, available payment, and who sets the tariff? And fifth one is government support. Viability gap funding, land clearances, utility shifting, revenue guarantees, and sixth one is performance security and penalties. So bank guarantees, liquidated damages, performance rating, and seventh one is termination and handback. What is the termination and handback? Termination payments on each party's default and the assets condition at handback. And eighth one, dispute resolution and renegotiation. The forum, the timeline, and whether the contract can be reopened without termination. So the principle that organizes all eight and write this sentence, what is that sentence is a risk should be allocated to the party best able to manage it, not the party least able to refuse it. So this is the important one, the principle. The principle that organizes all eight, that is right, this sentence is allocate risk to the private, risk to the party best able to manage it, not least able to refuse it. So construction and operating efficiency. What is the construction and operating efficiency? The private party manages those better. Give them the risk, land acquisition, statutory clearances, utility shifting. Only the state can manage those. Transferring them to the private party does not remove them, it makes them unpriceable. So the bidder either prices them punitively or does not bid. So, and that is not my argument. It is the government of India's. The Economic Survey 2025-26 records that PPP outcomes have been weakest where land acquisition, statutory clearances, demand assessment, or utility shifting has remained unsolved. So, its own words, in the coming decade, a credible PPP regime will be defined less by risk transfer on paper and more by the state's capacity to absorb early stage risks that private capital cannot efficiently price. So that sentence deployed in any PPP answer is worth more than a paragraph of your own analysis, because it is the governmental conceding the point. Conceding the point. I'm repeat it again. What is that? In the coming decade, a credible PPP regime will be defined less by risk transfer on paper and more by the state's capacity to absorb early stage risks that private capital cannot efficiently price. So this is the sentence. This is the sentence. So that sentence deployed in any PPP answer is worth more than a paragraph of your own analysis, because it is the government conceding the point. The two further factors the 2020 question specifically invites. What is that first one? Financial close and the cost of capital. Financial close and cost of the capital. A concession must be bankable. The lender, not the bidder, is the real counterparty, and termination payments exist mainly to make lenders whole. And second one is renegotiation. The survey says a renegotiation framework, renegotiation framework for complex cases to prevent termination is worth exploring, and the PPPs should be treated as evolving financial assets rather than one-time contracts frozen at financial close. So you have to say this. It is current, it is official, and it directly answers factors to be considered and name the standardization India has built. It casts one line and shows currency. Model RFQ, model RFP, model concession agreements, sector toolkits for roads, ports, solid waste management, and water and sanitation, and a reference guide called the waterfall framework for choosing the implementation mode. And now the single most current fact on this question, which almost nobody will have, the BOT. The BOT model concession agreement is being revamped for the first time since 2007, 2007 to 2008. The independent monitoring contract is completed and the finalization, the HAM model concession agreement is being finalized and EPC is being revised after HAM. So why the matter more than it looks? The BOT model the BOT model concession agreement predates the standard asset cycle, the arbitration backlog, and the entry of institutional capital into Indian roads. It was written for a market that no longer exists. So you have to rewriting BOT, HAM, and EPC together is an admission worth stand is is an admission worth stating plainly. So the problem was never the choice of model, it was the allocation of risk written into the standard document the need than that each model uses. A concession agreement is a contract about risk, and India is now redrafting the contract rather than switching between models. That pairs exactly with the survey. The survey diagnosis, Ministry of Road Transportation and Highways is redrafting, use both in the same answer, and the 2020 question is finished. And one more thing, the for the financing half, Ministry of Road Transportation and Highways has identified a PPP project pipeline of 13,400 kilometers costing 8.3 lakh crore to be developed in PPP model over the next 3 years. The sector level counterpart to the surveys 852 project 17 lakh crore all sector pipeline, all sector pipeline. And why PPP at all? And the honest ledger here is why PPP. What is the honest ledger here? Two questions, one scene. From 2022, 10 marker question in 2013 and 2022 asked, and 2022 question, that is 10 marker question. Why is public private partnership, that is PPP, public private, why is public private partnership, PPP, required in infrastructural projects? And from 2013, 10 marker question, adoption of PPP model for infrastructure development of the country has not been free of criticism. Critically discuss the pros and cons of the model. So answer them together in your head and split by word limit on the day. So we have four reasons PPP is required, not five, not seven, four, each with a distinct logic. The first one is fiscal. Fiscal, not because the government has no money, but because it has competing claims on it. Private capital expenditure in a PPP substitutes for public capex, that is capital expenditure, the government would otherwise have had to fund. That is the explicit accounting logic of NMP, National Monetization Pipeline 2.0, which counts private investment as monetization value on the ground that in the absence of monetization project, the government entity would have had to undertake the capital expenditure itself. And the second one is efficiency and technology. Whole of life costing. A party that must operate an asset for 30 years bills it differently from a contractor paid on completion. The third one is risk transfer. Construction and demand risk moved off the public balance sheet to the extent it is genuinely transferable, which is the whole debate. And fourth one is speed and capability, access to specialized operators and to capital markets that will not lend to a line ministry. So that the case for YPPP, for physical, fiscal, then efficiency, then risk transfer, then speed and complete. So now the criticism part, and be specific here. This is where the 2013 question is won or lost. On the one side, PPP, public private partnership, mobilizes private capital without immediate fiscal outgo, Whole of life incentives improve asset quality, risk moves to the better manager, service standards become contractual and enforceable. Global operating expertise arrives and public capacity is freed for non-commercial assets. On the other, it creates contingent liabilities that do not appear in the fiscal deficit. Renegotiation risk. Renegotiation risk, where aggressive bids are repriced after award. Risk transferred on paper while the state absorbs it in practice. User charges that are aggressive, so tolls fall hardest on those least able to pay. And thin competition in some sectors concentrating assets with a few players, and an asymmetry of expertise because the private side is better layered than the public authority. The single sharpest criticism, and the one the survey itself concedes, what is that at state and municipal level, PPP are still confused with EPC contracts, a partnership treated as a vendor arrangement and are perceived as selling of assets rather than the long-term service partnerships. The survey notes this wrong signaling creates two problems. It soars public opinion and it drives away the investors willing to hold risk across a 30 to 60 year concession. So the balanced conclusion to write, that is PPP is not a financing device. It is a procurement choice. It outforms public procurement where the service is measurable and demand is forecastable and the public authority is competent enough to write and enforce a contract. So where any one of those three fails, PPP underperforms and India's record maps exactly onto the test. So moving to the railway stations, the 2022 question answered with current data. The second half of the 2022 question, 10 marks. Examine the role of PPP model in redevelopment of railway stations in India. So start with the why a station is an unusual PPP asset. A station has two revenue streams and only one of them is passenger fares, which the which the concessionary does not get. The monetizable stream is commercial, retail, parking, advertising, and above all, the real estate around the station. So, station redevelopment is not transport PPP. It is a real estate finance transport upgrade, and every difficult follows from that. So, two models are in use and the distinction is examinable. First one model is OMT. What is OMT? And that is operate, maintain, transfer. The ministry builds the station on EPC. Once operational, a private operator runs and maintains it and pays the ministry a revenue share. Public money builds, private money operates. Model 2 is, that is DBFOT, where the private party designs, builds, finances, operates and transfers. Private money builds. Now the numbers here from the NMP, that is National Monetization Pipeline 2.0, station estate here 1 lakh crore, 1 lakh crore on OMT across 200 stations. Station development 7,500 crore. DBFOT on DBFOT across 15 stations. Other land assets 43,800 crore, 43,800 crore. In PPP quarters and commercial development. For context, the Amrut Bharat station scheme has identified 1337 stations for phased redevelopment, of which 15 are on PPP mode. On PPP mode. And railway PPPs to date, 18 completed, at 16,636 crore, with 7 under implementation at 16,334 crore as of September 2025. So now the analysis that lifts the answer. The point one here is the model has shifted and shifted for a reason. Look at the split, 1 lakh crore on OMT against 7,500 crore on DBFOT. Over 13 times as much value as being monetized through operate and maintain maintain concessions on states the government has already built as through concessions, where the private party builds. After the stalled first generation of station DBFOTs, Indian Railways has concluded that the private sector will operate a station but is reluctant to finance one. The private sector will operate a station but reluctant to not finance, but not reluctant to finance one. So what is that? Indian Railways has concluded that private sector will operate a station but is reluctant to finance one. That is the same greenfield versus brownfield pattern the survey identifies across the whole PPP program. So comes to the point two, that is the honest scale check. Of the 1337 stations identify under Amrut Bharat stations, Amrut Bharat stations, only 15 are PPP model. PPP is not the main instrument of station redevelopment in India. It is a targeted instrument for the largest commercially viable stations. And point three, the three real difficulties, land title and encroachment on railway land, which is the standard reason on these projects stall. Operating during construction, a station cannot close. So every project is a brownfield build and a live asset, and demand risk that is not the concessionaries to manage. So footfall depends on the train timetable, which railway which railways controls. A concessionary carrying commercial risk on a variable he cannot influence will discount his bid heavily. So that is a risk allocation error, and naming is one is exactly the vocabulary the concession scene built. So the demand risk, the error is what? The demand risk on a party that cannot influence demand. So moving to the challenges, airports joint ventures, the 2017 question. The 2017 question, 10 marker question, examine the developments of airports in India through joint ventures under public private partnership model. What are the challenges faced by the authorities in this regard? This is the question asked in 2017. The instrument, the instrument has a name and you must use it. OMDA, the operation, maintenance and development agreement. The survey calls the Ministry of Civil Aviation the spearhead of the OMDA model in India. The structure in three lines. A joint venture company is formed. AAI holds Airports Authority of India holds a minority equity stake. The private consortium holds the majority and operates. The joint venture pays AAI, that is Airport Authority of India, a revenue share on gross revenue plus an upfront fee, and the airport reverts at the end of concession. So the structure is the whole answer to developments through joint ventures, because it explains why the model spread. That state keeps ownership and a revenue claim, gets the terminal built with private capital and retains a board seat. The numbers, what are the numbers here? Airports went from 74 in 2014 to 164 in 2025. Passengers in financial year 25 were 421 million, projected to reach 665 million by financial year 30, first 31, 2031. So against an operational airport capacity of about 575 million passengers a year under NMP 2.0, 26 AAI airports go on OMDA for 14,950 crore in three bundles. So with bidding to begin on 11 and and disinvestment of AI's holdings in one subsidiary and four JV airports raises 12,550 crore. So note where the actual goes 100% to AAI, a public sector undertaking and nothing to be consolidated fund. And for scale, India has 0.11 airports per million people against 47.35 in the United States, 0.39 in China. Now the challenge here is five, and the fifth one is the one the separate answer. The first one is tariff regulation. Who sets aeronautical charges and on what asset base? The single till versus dual till question, whether non-aeronautical revenue from retail, parking and real estate is used to cross subsidies aeronautical charges, is the single most litigated issue in India airport PPP. So AERA arbitrates it. So you have to name it. And second one, the state as both shareholder and regulator. AIA holds equity in the joint venture and is the sector operating authority. That is a structural conflict. And NMP 2.0 was proposal to divest AI's stake in for JV airports, joint venture airports is best read as a partial resolution of it. And third one is cross subsidy of unviable airports. Profitable metro airports have historically funded loss making regional ones. So bundle the profitable ones out to private operators and cross subsidy has to be rebuilt explicitly, which is one reason Udan exists as separate budget funded scheme. And the fourth one, concentration. A small number of consortia hold most of India's pri- privatized airport capacity. Competition for the market is not competition in the market. And the fifth one is traffic risk asymmetry. Traffic risk asymmetry. And this is your best line. Airport passenger traffic is driven by macroeconomic cycles, aviation fuel prices, and airline solvency, none of which the concessionary controls. A concession that puts full traffic risk on the operator, therefore prices that risk into the bid and the passenger pays for it in charges. So that is the same risk allocation error as the railway station footfall problem. So appearing in a different sector, find that out and the examiner sees a candidate who has understood the model, not memorized two case studies. So what is the intergenerational liabilities? And the hardest question in this head, that is 2014 question asked 12.5 markers. The question is, explain how private public partnership arrangements in long gestation infrastructure projects can transfer unsustainable liabilities to the future. What arrangements need to be put in place to ensure that successive generations capacities are not compromised? So this is the best question in the set and the one most likely to be reframed and re-asked. So first one is four mechanisms. Four mechanisms transfers liability forward. So you have to name all four. They are separable and each is a mark. And first one is contingent liabilities. Guarantees the state gives that do not appear anywhere in today's fiscal deficit. Minimum revenue guarantees, exchange rate guarantees, and termination payments owed to lenders if the project fails. They cost nothing today and everything if the risk materializes. A fiscal deficit that excludes them understates the commitment. And the second one is committed annuity streams. Committed annuity streams. Under the HAM and BOT annuity, the government contracts to pay a fixed sum every year for 15 or 20 years. So that is the budget rigidity created by a decision a future finance minister did not take and cannot reverse. And third one is deferred maintenance and handback condition. Deferred maintenance and handback condition. If the contractor does not specify the condition of the asset at handback, the concessionary's rational strategy in the final years is to under maintain. The state receives back a depreciated asset and pays to restore it. And fourth one is renegotiation on the state's weakest ground. A distressed project cannot simply be allowed to fail. The road still has to carry traffic, so the state renegotiates from a position of no alternative, and the revised terms are worse. So the intergenerational sentence, a PPP concession is a claim on future budgets made by a present government. So the deficit records the deficit record what was borrowed. The deficit records what was borrowed. It does not record what was promised. The deficit records was not was what was borrowed, not what was promised. So the deficit records what was borrowed, it does not record what was promised. So fiscal responsibility measured only by the deficit is therefore a partial accounting of what one generation has committed to the next to pay. Comes to the second half, the arrangements. You have to write six and give them in this order. The first one is disclose. What is the disclose? Contingent liabilities must be quantified and published. What is not measured cannot be limited. And the second one is cap, a ceiling on aggregate guarantees and annuity commitments as a share of revenue receipts. In the same way, debit is capped. And the third one is specify handback, contractual asset condition standards, a transfer with retention money against them. And then fourth one is measure the depreciation. And India now does. This is your current affairs edge. NMP 2.0 introduced aggregate monetization value, which is total monetization value adjusted for the depreciation in the asset during the concession period. Across the pipeline, AMV is 12.18 lakh crore against a TMV of 16.72 lakh crore, 72.8%. In power, it is 49.4%. In telecom, it is negative minus 2625 crore on a TMV of 4800 crore. A government that publishes a negative number on its own program is doing the intergenerational accounting. The 2014 question asks for. You have to say that. And fifth one is build a renegotiation framework before you need one. So the survey's own recommendation on that point is preventive. A framework negotiated in calm is worth more than settlement negotiated in distress. Distress. The sixth one is retire risk before the bid, not after. Land clearances, utility shifting. The cheapest intergenerational protection is a project that does not go into distress. So then we are moving to next scene, that is asset monetization, and the definition everyone gets wrong. So no question has been asked on asset monetization yet. That is precisely why it is the live risk in this head. Two pipelines, NMP 1.0 ran from financial year 22 to financial year 25 across 13 sectors with a 6 lakh crore target and achieved 89%. That is 5.3 lakh crore led by highways, coal mines, petroleum and natural gases and ports. NMP 2.0 runs financial year 26 to 2030 across 12 sectors with a budget announcement of 10 lakh crore and a NITI pipeline of 16.72 lakh crore. It is the largest sector is highways, multimodal logistic parks and ropeways at 4.42 lakh crore, 26% of the pipeline. And this is and its largest single asset class is interstate transmission lines on BOT at 2 lakh crore. And there is a trap that will catch most candidates. 1 lakh crore is the budget 2025 to 2026 as announcement. 16.72 lakh crore is the NITI Aayog pipeline arrived at after ministry consultation. Both are correct, but you have but never write one without the other. So now the definition, and this is the highest value 30 seconds in this chapter. What is that? Total monetization value is not money the government will receive. So TMV equals proceeds received upfront plus the present value of expected future proceeds plus estimated private capital expenditures in the projects. So what is the TMV? Upfront plus PV of future proceeds plus private capex. So total monetization value, that is TMV, is not money the government will receive. TMV equals to proceeds received upfront plus the present value of expected future proceeds and plus estimated private capital expenditure in the projects. So NMP's own accrual accrual table proves it. What is that? Of the 10.82 lakh crore flowing within 20 financial year 2026 to 2030, 39% is direct to private investment. 39% is direct to private investment, never touches a government account. The consolidated fund of India takes 43%, private investment 39%, public sector undertakings and port authorities 51%, 15%, 15, and state consolidated funds 4%. A candidate who writes the government will raise 16.72 lakh crore by selling assets has made two errors in one class. The government is not selling, ownership is retained and assets revert, and it is not raising that sum. So the scale check that wins the conclusion government side flows under NMP 2.0. Consolidated fund PSUs and states together average about 1.33 lakh crore a year. So the union's budgeted capital expenditure for financial year 27 alone is 12.22 lakh crore. Asset monetization at full delivery is a supplement of roughly 11% to the budgetary capital program. It is real, it is useful, and it is not a substitute for the budget. So two more facts that separates a good answer from a competent one. The first one is 35% of the pipeline lands after financial year 31. Financial year 31. 5.90 lakh crore falls outside the plan period, and in mining 84% does. Monetization targets and monetization receipts are on different clocks. Second one is monetization is not privatization. Ownership stays with the state. The asset reverts, and pure commercial sale of land where proceeds do not create an equivalent asset is expressly outside NMP 2.0 is purview. So that single sentence answers the most political objection to the program. Finally, the instruments, one line in each, they are examinable vocabulary, that is TOT, TOT, toll operator transfer, TOT, toll operator transfer. The private party pays an upfront fee for the right to collect user charges on a bundle of built roads. INVIT, invite, Infrastructure Investment Trust, built revenue earning assets pooled into a listed trust made under the SEBI invite. Regulations 2014. NHAI holds 16% with CPP, IB, and OTPP, two Canadian public pension funds as principal investors, and three managing entities: trustee, investment manager, and project manager. So, naming CPP, IB, and OTPP is worthy a line. It is a service new class of investor claim made concrete and securitization, future cash flows sold with strict conditions, no charge on the PSU's balance sheet, no corporate guarantee, escrow and proceeds earmarked for capex or debit reduction. So those conditions exist to stop securitization become disguised borrowing. And what MORTH, Ministry of Road Transport and Highways, has actually raised. So you have to say this as a correction. It is a teaching moment to March 31st, 2025. 1,42,578 crore in total. Securitization through as a special purpose vehicle, 50,125 crore, 35.1%. And all of it one project, the Delhi Mumbai Expressway. Toll operate transfer, 48,995 crore, 34.3% across 11 bundles and 2,564 kilometers. And invite 443,638 crore, 30.6% across 4 bundles and 2,345 kilometers, plus 12,357 crore awarded in November 2025 under TOT bundles 17 and 18 across 440 kilometers against and financial year 26 target 30 financial year target of 30,000 crore. So now the correction one here, what is the correction? The surveys 1.52 lakh crore is roughly the right number and the wrong composition. 1,42,758 crore plus 12,357 crore awarded in November 2025 is 1,55,115 crore, close to the service figure. But TOT and INVIT together are only 92,633 crore, about 61% of the service 1.52 lakh crore, and 59.7% of the 1 lakh 55,115 crore, that is 115 crore actually raised. So name the denominator when you say it and never repeat the service composition. So the instrument sentence, NHAI single largest monetization instrument is neither the toll operate transfer model nor the INVIT. So it is securitization and the entire 50,125 crores. 125 crores, 50,125 crore of its one project, the Delhi Mumbai Expressway, a special purpose vehicle wholly owned by NHAI bundles road assets and securitizes the future user free. NHAI continues to collect the toll and maintain the road, transferring enough to service the SPV tipped. So TOT sells an opening asset and INVIT pools several. Securitization sells nothing at all. It sells a claim on a cash flow and the asset never leaves the balance sheet. And the pipeline is priced on realized transactions, not aspiration. TOT has realized about 19.1 crore per kilometer across 2,564 kilometers, and the INVIT bundles about 18.6 crore per kilometer against NMP 2.0 implied roughly 19.3 crore per kilometer for its largest highway asset class. That is a reassuring finding worth one line, because most commentary assumes the opposite. One caution, TOT bundle 17 and 18 realized 28.1 crore per kilometer, well above the average. Do not overread a single bundle. And a second financing development this year that almost nobody carries, that is Sagarmala project. Sagarmala Development Company Limited, set up in August 2016, was restructured in June 2025 as Sagarmala Finance Corporation Limited, India's first non-banking financial company focused on the maritime sector. Within 6 months, it had approved about 4,300 crore of loan sanctions by December 2025. Alongside it sits the Maritime Development Fund of 25,000 crore. So India built two new maritime financing vehicles in a single year where it previously had none. And this is a direct structural answer to the survey's own diagnosis that institutional capital takes brownfield while greenfield still relies on bank balance sheets. So a dedicated sectoral NBFC is precisely the instrument for assets that banks price punitively. So the development finance sentence, the standard prescription for India's infrastructure financing gap is to deepen the corporate bond market. The more interesting development of 2025 is narrower and more concrete. The 25,000 crore Maritime Development Fund and the conversion of a project development company into India's first maritime focused NBFC with sanctioned 4,300 crore within 6 months of restructuring. Both the sector specific development finance and instrument India largely abandoned after the development financial institutions of 1990s. Whether that is a considered return to a proven model or a workaround for a bond market that still will not price greenfield risk is the question worth asking, and either answer is better one than India needs deeper bond markets. And do not confuse the two. Two Maritime Development Fund is a fund, confuse the two. So the Maritime Development Fund is a fund, rupees 20,000 crore. Maritime Investment Fund. Development is different. Maritime Investment Fund at 49% government equity plus a 5,000 crore interest incentivization fund. SMFCL is an NBFC, different instruments, different balance sheets. So one last item, the first public INVIT now has a name, that is Rajmarga INVIT with SEBI clearance under process targeted for financial year 2025-2026. So what is the FDI? What is the FDI cluster? Four dormant questions handled once. Four questions here and they come as one block. From 2014, foreign direct investment in the defense sector is now set to be liberalized. What influence this expected? This is expected to have an Indian defense and economy in the short and long run. From 2013, twice on the impact of FDI entry into multi-brand retail on supply chain management and on why that FDI did not pick up a year after it was allowed, and from 2016 justify the need for FDI for the developments of the Indian economy. Why there is a gap between MOUs signed and the actual FDIs? Suggest remedial steps. The three 2013 and 2014 questions came in 18 months and have been silent, silent since the 2016 question sits under the Indian economy head, but it is an investment model question in substance. Treat all four as one revision block, not four chapters. So, and why FDI belongs in an investment model chapter at all? FDI is a capital formation by a non-resident who takes a lasting management interest, which is what distinguishes it from portfolio flows. It is an investment model in exactly the sense the first scene defined. Defense FDI, short run and long run. Short run, technology access, offset driven supplier development, and a foreign partner willing to invest because it now can hold a controlling stake. Also, immediately import substitution on the subsystem and rather than on platforms. Comes to long run, a domestic defense industrial base, export capability, and the real price strategic autonomy because a country that cannot make what it fights with cannot choose when to fight. And the counter arguments, and give at least two foreign control of strategically sensitive production, technology that arrives as assembly rather than transfer, and the risk that a liberalized route substitutes for rather than builds indigenous R&D capability and connect it to today because the 2014 framing is stale. India's current defense industrial argument runs through indigenization lists, the defense production and export promotion policy, and MSME participation in defense value chains. And the survey now carries a concrete example of state level innovation finance doing exactly this. Maharashtra's Defense and Aerospace Venture Fund, a 330 crore category to AIS set up in 2018, investing in precision engineering, aerospace components, UAV systems, and defense subsystems, and helping MSMEs obtain defense certifications and export readiness. And one sentence, and your answer is decade more current than the question. The multi-brand retail. The both 2013 questions in one frame. On supply chain management, the argued gains are back-end investment in cold chain and warehousing. Disintermediation. Disintermediation between farmer and retailer and better price realization for producers. The argued losses are pressure on small retailers and on the traditional mandi trade. And why it did not pick up? Five reasons. They are all still true. One, states could opt out, so the market was fragmented by geography. The second one is 30% local sourcing from small industry was operationally hard to satisfy at scale. And third one, a minimum investment requirement with a mandate share in back end infrastructure. The fourth one is policy uncertainty. An investor commits for 20 years and cannot price a rule that a future government may reverse. And the fifth one is, and this is the one to lead with the commercial case changer under math, the policy. E-commerce and the single brand and cash and carry routes offer the same market access without the multi-brand conditions. The 2016 question is the MOU gap, and it answer itself of this chapter suspend. And why FDI is needed? Three reasons and no more. It is capital that does not create external debit. Unlike commercial borrowing, it carries a technology and management practice that portfolio flows do not, and it brings market access through the investors' existing global channels. Now the gap is, and this is where most answers become a list of complaints. State the mechanism instead. So don't list the complaints. Instead of that, you have to provide the mechanism. An MOU is a statement of intent signed at the announcement stage. An actual FDI inflow is a capital committed after the project has cleared land, approvals, utilities, and a demand assessment. The gap between them is not a measure of insincerity. It is a measure of how much project preparation risk that state left unresolved between the signature and the spade. And that is the same finding this chapter makes about PPP. The survey's own words, outcomes are weakest where land acquisition clearances, demand assessment, or utility shifting remain unresolved. An unconverted MOU and a stalled concession are the same failure wearing different paperwork. So remedial steps and make them follow from the diagnosis rather than from a generic list. So retire the risk before the signature, not after. So pre-cleared land, pre-approved utilities, prior demand assessment, publish conversion rates rather than announcements totals, because what is measured and what gets managed. Give single window clearance, real statutory teeth rather than a portal, and accept the honest qualification. Some attrition is normal and healthy. An economy where every announced intention converted would be one of that was not under accept the honest qualification. Some attrition is normal and healthy. An economy where announced intention converted would be that was not attracting speculative interest at all. One quantified illustration, and it is unusually clean. The Protection of Interest in Aircraft Objects Act. So accept the honest qualification. Some attrition is normal, some attrition is normal and healthy. An economy where every announced intention converted would be one of that was not attracting speculative interest at all. One quantified illustration and it is unusually clean. The Protection of Interest in Aircraft Objects Act, which became law on 16th April 2025, gave domestic effect to the Cape Town Convention of 2001, which India had adopted in 2008 without the enforcement machinery. The gap left Indian carriers paying aircraft leasing costs typically 8 to 10% higher than other countries. So legal certainty was worth 8 to 10% of the cost capital in one sector, and it took 17 years to supply. And the transferable lesson, which is why the FDA cluster sits in this chapter, multi-brand retail failed for exactly the reason the economic survey now pays PPPs fail. The economic survey now says PPPs fail. The state announced a liberalization and left the execution risk unresolved. Outputs, sourcing rules, and reversibility are to an investor and the same category of risk as unresolved land acquisition policy. Certainly, it is itself a form of risk allocation. So, India has spent 20 years arguing about how much risk to transfer to the private sector. What the government now concedes is that the question has moved. It is no longer how much risk the private party will take. It is how much risk the state can retire before the bid is opened. So India has spent 20 years arguing about how much risk to transfer to the private sector. What the government now concedes is that question has moved. It is no longer how much risk the private party will take. It is how much risk the state can retire before the bid is opened. So, what are the most probable questions for the chapter 2026? The first one is National Monetization Pipeline 2.0 has been described as a means of financing infrastructure without adding to public debate. Examine this claim. What safeguards are necessary to ensure that asset monetization does not compromise public interest? So you have to write lead with the TMV definition. The safeguards are AMV and securitization conditions, the exclusion of pure commercial land sale and handbag standards. So the next one is the cause. The success of public-private partnership in India has been sectoral, not national. Critically examined with reference to the institutional framework for PPPs. So you have to write like this: roads, ports, powers, and renewables have matured. Health, education, sanitation, and urban infrastructure have not. PPP, AC, VGF, IIPDF, the 3 year pipeline, and the state capacity argument. With this conclusion. So then third one, discuss the factors that determine whether an infrastructure project should be procured through EPC or through a public-private partnership. Illustrate with examples from the transport sector. So you have to write like this: the three-part test, measurable service, forecastable demand, competent public authority, then illustrated with railway stations and airports. So then we are moving to next chapter, that is infrastructure and energy. So what is the infrastructure and what is the energy we are going to discuss? Comes to the pattern. 6 questions across 13 years and 5 of the 6 are about energy. About energy. The examiner have asked about renewable status twice. The cost collapses once, and the grid once, and the SDG framing once, and only the 2021 question steps back to the ask what infrastructure investment is for. So this chapter has an argument with a frame around it. So the frame is the first scene. Investment in infrastructure is settled as to quantum and unsettled as to distribution. So everything after it is the energy transition examined from 5 directions: the target, the access test, the status, the price, and the where. So what is the framing question? The 2021 question asked 15 marker. Investment in infrastructure is essential for more rapid and inclusive economic growth. Discuss in the light of India's experience. This question opens the chapter because it contains the chapter's whole argument in one adjective. So we have to read. Investment in infrastructure is essential for more rapid and inclusive economic growth. Discuss the light of India's experience. So find the word doing the work, not investment, not growth, inclusive. Because India has decisively answered the question of how much. It has not answered the question of for whom. Start with how much because the record is genuinely remarkable. Government of India capital expenditure rose from 3.07 lakh crore in financial year 2019 to 5.92 lakh crore in financial year 2022, up to 92% and to 11.21 lakh crore in financial year 26 budget estimates, up another 89% in budget 2026-2027. Capital expenditure is 12 lakh 21,821 crore and effective capital expenditure 17 lakh 14,523 crore. As a share of GDP, capex went from 1.7% to pre-pandemic to 2.9 post. Effective capex from 2.7 to 3.9 and 4.0 present in financial year 2025. So provisional actuals multiplier estimates run 2.5 to 3.5. So you have to now the number that reframes it. The revenue deficit as a share of the physical deficit fell from 71.4% in financial year 20 to 33.4% in financial year 26 budget estimates. So capital expenditure as a share of the physical deficit rose from 36.0% to 71.5%. India has changed what it borrows for. In financial year 20, roughly 7 rupees in every 10 borrowed went to consumption. But by financial year 26 budget estimates, roughly 7 in 10 go to assets. And the international comparison completes it. The share of government revenue directed to investment, India 19.6%, Indonesia 19.7%, United States 10.8%, Germany 6.1%, Brazil 5.2%. So an essential, the question is settled and India has acted on it. Now the inclusive half, and this is where answer ends the marks. So infrastructure is inclusive through four channels and they are not equally strong. Access, a road, a grid, a connection or an airport changes what is possible for people who previously had no option. Rural roads and electrification are the clearest cases. Second one, cost. What is the cost? Cost. Better infrastructure lowers the cost of everything that moves, which is a regressive to progressive shift because the poor spend a larger share of income on transported goods. Comes to employment, construction is labor intensive and absorbs exactly the semi skilled workers the manufacturing sector has not. And the productivity of existing assets. A farmer with cold storage sells a different crop, and one sector where the delivery is documented worth 30 seconds. So, because it is evidence rather than assertion, Sagarmala launched March 2015 for port-led development. 845 project, 845 projects worth 6.06 lakh crore, of which 315 are completed at 1.57 lakh crore as at 24th March 2026. The outcomes major ports handle a record of 915.17 million tons in financial year 2025-2026, up 7.06%, and say major ports because over 200 non-major ports are excluded. Average vessel turnaround fell from 96 hours in 2014 to 49.5 hours in 2025 on all vessel basis. And inland waterway cargo rose from 18.10 to 145.50 million tons a year since financial year 2014. But you have to read the delivery honestly, because it is the chapter's own point about composition. After 11 years, 29.5%, 25.9% of Sagarmala's value is complete. 1.57 of 6.06 lakh crore, though 37.3% by count, and 320 of 845 projects, 37.9%, are still at planning stage. So the average completed project is 498 crore against a pipeline average of 717 crore. So the large capital heavy projects are systematically the unfinished ones. So as pace, present that as pace and project mix, not as value. The outcome numbers are strong, but you have to present like that pace and project mix, not as a failure. The outcome numbers are strong. And the counter argument here is what, which must be you have to given, that is infrastructure investment is not automatically inclusive, because the composition decides the incidence. A metro corridor and a bus fleet deliver very different to person throughout a rupee to very different people. An expressway and rural road serve different users, and the same finding this chapter reaches latter applies here. So capital went to the most expensive form of person throughout while buses, through put while buses. So footpaths and demand management went underfunded. So India has settled the question of whether infrastructure investment is essential and has acted on it decisively. So union capital expenditure rose from 3.07 lakh crore in financial year 2019 to 11.21 lakh crore in financial year 26 budget estimates. Effective capital expenditure now runs near 4% of GDP, and the composition of borrowing has inverted. The revenue deficit fell from 71.4% of the fiscal deficit to 33.4%, while capital expenditure rose from 36.0 to 71.5%. So India now borrows overwhelmingly to invest rather than to consume. So India directs 19.6% of government revenue into investment against 10.8% in the United States and 6.1% in Germany. So what remains unsettled is the second adjective in the question. So infrastructure is inclusive growth access, transport cost, construction, employment, and the productivity of existing assets. So but it is incidence, its incidence is decided by composition, not by quantum. And a rupee spent on a metro corridor and a rupee spent on a bus fleet reach different to people. I already told you the quantum question is answered, the composition question is not here. So the deficit now buys assets instead of consumption. So whether those assets reach everyone is a different question, and the budget does not answer it. So the 50% question here is, and why it has three different answers. The 2022 question, 15 marker question, this is, do you think India will meet 50% of its energy needs from renewable energy by 2030? Justify your answer. How will the shift of subsidies from fossil fuels to renewable help achieve the above objective? Explain. So you have to read. That question contains three separate conflations, and unpicking them is wholesale. Conflation 1. Capacity is not generation. India's commitment is expressed in installed capacity. Electricity delivered is a different quantity. And conflation 2. Renewables are not non-fossils. Non-fossil includes nuclear and large hydro. Renewables excluding large hydro is a third, smaller number. The conflation 3, electricity is not energy. India's energy needs including cooking, transport, fuel and industrial heat. Electricity is a part of primary energy, not the whole of it. So now the capacity, all India as on 31st March 2026, total installed capacity 5,32,740 megawatts, coal 2,21,940, that is 41.7% of total. Total fossils 2,49,272, 46.8. Solar solar 1,50,261, that is 28.2. Wind 56,095, 10.5, that is the percentage. Large hydro 51,165 megawatts, 9.7. Renewables including hydro 2,74,688 and 51.6, this percentage. Nuclear 8780, that is 1.6%, and total non-fossil 2,83,468 megawatts, that is 53.2%. Comes to the answer 1. On installed non-fossil capacity, the target is already met 4 years early, 53.2% at March 31st, 2026. And renewables alone, including large hydro, are 51.6%. India crossed the halfway line during the last 4 months of financial year 26. Note that the economic survey returned to November 2025 still says 49.83%. You will be quoting a number the survey does not have. So second answer 2, and electricity generated India is nowhere near 50%. The generation target of 2025-26 was 2000.4 billion units. Thermal 1503.262, then renewables excluding large hydro 275, hydro 155.674, nuclear 56.592, and Bhutan imports 9.472. Non-fossil fuels, non-fossil fuels sources therefore account for about 24% of the electricity against 53% of the capacity. So non-fossil is over half of India's installed capacity and about a quarter of its electricity. And it comes to the third one, and total energy needs lower still because transport runs on petroleum and industry runs on coal, and neither is counted in the electricity numbers at all. So the examiner's question get a precise answer, not a yes or no. India has already met the 50% commitment is it actually made non-fossil installed capacity and will not meet the target of question describes, because 50% of energy needs from the renewable was never the commitment and is not achievable by 2030. So the gap between the two numbers is capacity utilization. A solar plant runs at a capacity utilization factor in the high teens to low 20s. So a coal plant at a plant load factor are 65, a coal plant at a plant load factor of 65% produces 3 times as much from the same nameplate rating. So a megawatt of solar and a megawatt of coal are the same number and not the same thing. So India crossed India crossed 50% non-fossil capacity milestone ahead of its 2030 commitment. And that achievement is real. But capacity is a stock and electricity is a flow. The remaining distance in India's energy transition is not measured in gigawatts of installed panels. It is measured in storage, in dispatchability, and in the flexibility of the grid. Every further addition of variable renewable capacity, renewable capacity widens the gap between the two numbers unless storage closes it. capacity and storage, capacity and installed capacity and storage both are different. That is why battery storage and pumped hydro are not an accessory to India's renewable program. They are the binding constraint on it. The second half of the question is the subsidy shift. So we have to handle these three moves. The honest about what do not have, that is move one, the mechanism. A fossil fuel subsidy lowers the price of the incumbent fuel and therefore rises the effective hurdle rate for the entrant. Removing it does not fund renewables, it stops penalizing them. That is a cleaner argument than the money is redirected, and it is the correct one. The second one is what India has actually done. India's renewable India's renewable support has not been a consumption subsidy at all. It has been capital and risk support, viability gap funding, solar park that pre-clear land and execution and evacuation, sorry, competitive reverse actions and payment security mechanisms. The subsidy that mattered was a risk subsidy, not a price subsidy. The third one is the caution. Removing fossil fuel subsidies is regressive at the point of consumption, and that is why LPG and kerosene reform has always been politically slower than power sector reform. So, four objectives. What are four objectives? SDG 7. This is 2018 question. 150 words 10 marker question. Access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy is the sine qua non to achievable sustainable development goals. Comment on the progress made in this regard in India. The question is sustainable development goal 7, SDG number 7. Quoted almost same verbatim, and it hands you own structure you have to write. Four adjectives, four tests. Answer is separately and grade each honestly. So most answers treat it as one question about renewables, but it is four questions. And India's score differs on each. The test one is access. Access substantially achieved. Household electrification is substantially universal following Saubhagya. This is the one where the progress is unambiguous and should be stated first and briefly. The second one, reliable. The second one is what? Reliable. Very nearly solved, and the numbers are startling. The energy deficit fell from minus 10.1% to 10.1% in when 20 2009-10 to minus 0.03%. Peak deficit from minus 12.7% to minus 0.01%. A country that could not meet a tenth of its demand 15 years ago now meets essentially all of it. So it is the strongest single fact in the scene, and it is rarely taught. So the third one is affordable, mixed, and is a it is a distribution question, not a price question. AT and C losses fell from 22.62 to 15.04%. The ACS ARR gap from 0.78 to 0.06 rupees per unit. Discom profit after tax went from minus 67,962 crore in financial year 2014 to plus 12 plus 2,701 crore in financial year 25, and late payment surcharge dues from 1.4 lakh crore in June 22 to 4,927 crore in January 26. So the distribution business has been repaired at the aggregate level, but affordability in India is a cross subsidy arrangement. Industrial and commercial consumers pay above cost so that agricultural and residential consumers pay below it. That is a transfer, not a low cost, and it raises the cost of exactly the manufacturing the rest this paper wants to grow. The test 4, that is sustainable and modern. Incomplete, and the reason is the chapter's spine. Non-fossils is 53.2% of installed capacity and about 24% of the 2025-26 generation target. Capacity is not generation. You have to simply understand this. Capacity is not generation. Installed different thing, generation different thing. Installed capacity is different thing, generation is different thing. Capacity is not generation. The gap is capacity utilization, which makes storage and dispatchability the binding constraint rather than more panels. And modern note, two genuinely new things, that is PM Surya Gar at 25,728 megawatts of solar and the India's energy stack, digital public infrastructure for the power sector, framed by the survey as moving from energy access to energy agency. The four adjective sentence is the SDG 7 sets four tests and India's record differs sharply across them. On access, the objective is substantially achieved. On reliability, the transformation is the least quoted fact in Indian energy policy. The energy deficit has fallen from minus 10.1% in 2009 to 910 to minus 0.03% in 2025, and peak deficit from minus 12.7 to minus 0.01%. So a country that could not meet a tenth of its demand now meets nearly of all of it. And affordability distribution finances have been repaired at the aggregate level, with A T and C losses down from 22.62 to 15.04%, and the ACS ARR gap down from 0.78 to 0.06%. But affordability rests on cross subsidy that raises industrial tariffs. So it is a transfer rather than a low cost. And sustainability, non-fossil sources are 53.2% of installed capacity, but only about a quarter of generation. So a quarter of generation, which means the remaining problem is utilization and storage rather than capacity addition. India has solved access. India has solved access, very nearly solved reliability, converted affordability into cross subsidy question, and left sustainability as a generation question that adding capacity does not answer. And moving to the scene number 4, that is what is that scene number 4? Status, targets, and the cheapest megawatt of all. This is the 2016 question, 12.5 marker. The question is give an account of the current status and the targets to be achieved pertaining to renewable energy sources in the country. Discuss in brief the importance of national program on light emitting diodes. So the first half is the capacity anchor from scene 2. So do not repeat it. So reference it move. So two things to add on status. The first one is the shape of addition. In the first 8 months of financial year 26 to November 2025, India added 34.56 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity, the largest ever. Solar 27.20, wind 3.95, hydro 2.68, nuclear 0.70, bio 0.03. Solar is doing nearly 4/5 of the work. And the second one is India's global position. Third one is overall renewable capacity. Third in installed solar, fourth in wind. And the ownership fact here is which almost nobody carries. As on 31st March 2026, private sector 2,78,632 megawatts, 52.3%. States 1,30,000 to 24.4%. Central 1,24,108, that is 23.3%. The private sector owns more of India's generation capacity than the center and all the state combined. It got three. It got there without a single privatization of central generating company through license free generation under the Electricity Act of 2003, and above all through the renewable actions, which are almost entirely private. So deploy that in any question about private participation in infrastructure. So now comes to the second half of the LED half, and this is where the question is actually one. The national program on LEDs runs as two schemes: Ujala for household bulbs and the street lighting national program for municipal street lights, both implemented by EESL, an energy services company under the Ministry of Power. Why an LED program sits inside a renewable energy question? Give this argument in this examiner's real target. You have to write that the cheapest megawatt is the one you do not have to generate. A unit saved at the point of consumption avoids not only the generation cost but the transmission loss also, the distribution loss, and the capital cost of the capacity itself. Demand side efficiency is supply side capacity by another route, and it is available faster and cheaper than any new plant. So three further points here is each have one mark, each have a mark. Bulk procurement changed the market, not just the bulb. EESL aggregated demand across the country and drove the procurement price of an LED bulb down by an order of magnitude. That is demand aggregation as an industrial policy instrument, and is the same logic that later produced solar actions, and peak load is binding constraint, and lightning is a peak coincident load. Street lighting and household lighting run in the evening at exactly the hour when solar output is zero and the grid is most stressed. Efficiency in lighting therefore relieves the peak, which is worth far more than an equivalent saving spread across the day. And zero subsidy delivery, the on bill and pay as you save models let households take the bulb without upfront cost, repaid from the savings. It is an efficiency program financed by the efficiency it creates. The figures as on 6 January 2025 state the date. That is both schemes launched 5th January 2015. Ujala originally the domestic efficient lighting program covers household bulbs, tube lights and fans. SLMP Prakash Path covers street lighting. Ujala has delivered 36.87 crore LED bulbs, saving 47,883 million kilowatt hours and 19,153 crore a year, avoiding 9,586 megawatts of peak demand and 38.8 million tons of carbon dioxide. SLNP has delivered 1.34 crore LED street lights, saving 9,001 million units, avoiding 1,500 megawatts of peak and 6.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. So now the two competitions then win this half the question. The cheapest megawatt with both sides sourced 9586 megawatts plus 1500 is 11,860 megawatts, 86 megawatts of peak demand avoided. So against India's all India peak demand to 2,45,444 megawatts in financial year 26, that is 4.52%. Nearly 1/20th of India's peak demand was removed rather than supplied. So and the exchequer did not pay for it. That is only place in this chapter where the demand side measure can be set against supply side capacity in the same units. From the two government sources, say the ratio and put arithmetic on, put arithmetic in the answers, and the achievement is the market, not the distribution. So Ujala distributed 36.87 crore bulbs, 4,407.992 crore LED bulbs were sold in the Indian market. The scheme supplied about 9% of them, so roughly 91% of India's LED bulbs were bought at ordinary market prices outside the scheme. So you have to read that as success. The barrier was price, not preference, and LED cost 450 to 500 rupees in 24 against to 10 rupees to 15 rupees and incandescent bulb and held under 1% of lightning market in 2013-14. Demand aggregation and competitive bidding. Competitive bidding brought the scheme price to 70 and the market price followed it down. A distribution program that ends up supplying a tenth of the market is it created has not underperformed, has made itself unnecessary, which is the intended terminal state of market transformation instrument. What is the LED sentence here? The national LED program is usually assessed usually assessed on distribution 36.87 crore bulbs under Ujala and 1.34 crore street lights under the street lightening national program. The more important figures is that 407.92 crore LED bulbs were sold in the Indian market over the same period. So the scheme supplied about a tenth of the bulbs and the market supplied the rest. So that is the correct measure of the intervention because the barrier was never preference but price by aggregating household demand and awarding supply throughout competitive bidding. The program brought the scheme price to 70 rupees and pulled the market down behind it without any subsidy, which is why it is described as the world's largest zero subsidy domestic lightening program. And the demand side saving is not marginal. Ujala and SLNP together avoided 11,086 megawatts of peak demand, about 4.5% of India's peak, at a moment in the evening when solar output is zero. So one clarification to make here on air, because the two claims can be confused. Zero subsidy means no money from the exchequer. The consumer paid 70 rupees. It does not mean to upfront cost was ever addressed. On bill and pay as you save, options existed separately through discounts. Keep the two part and SLNP's business model in one line, that is EESL bears the entire upfront cost of the street lights and recoups it through monthly or quarterly annuities paid by the municipality while maintaining them at over 95% uptime. The municipality contributes no capital. The annuity is paid out of the saving. That is an ESCO model, a fourth financing route alongside EPC, BOT, and HAM. And it's a counter example that proves chapter 10b smart city diagnosis. It worked precisely because it required no municipal capital and no municipal capability. So then we are moving to scene number 5, the solar cost collapse and what it did to thermal power. This will be discussing in the next class.